Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. In this one, we'll talk about how to access the HTTP context in different ASP.NET Core application types. Now, this is for sure not a very complicated topic, but I see a lot of confusion around that. Even if it's very simple, I guess Microsoft did maybe not really do exactly the best job because, for instance, in similar places, you actually have to access the same HTTP context using different naming conventions, and that might be a little bit weird and might actually guide us off track. So the scope of this video is actually to take a look at three of the most important application types that we might have in ASP.NET Core. So we will look at the Razor Pages application, we will look at the regular MVC application, so with Razor frontend, and we will look into how we can interact with the HTTP context in a web API. Of course, there would be a different topic, which would be how we actually can use or work with the HTTP context in Blazor server, because we might for sure need to actually use some information from the context there, but there is a different programming model and things are a little bit more complicated than that. And the next video on this channel after this one will be dedicated only to how to actually work with the HTTP context in a Blazor server application. Now let's get started with our own scope for this video. So as said, the first thing that we want to actually take a look is how we actually can use and access the HTTP context in an ASP.NET Core Razor Pages application. And when we talk about Razor Pages here, actually the programming model is very simple and straightforward. Of course, besides this program class, which is starting with .NET 6, actually the kind of like the startup class or the universal startup class of an ASP.NET Core application, there are actually two things that we just have to take a look at. So in Razor Pages, we just have this CS HTML files, which are Razor views, and for each Razor view, we have a code behind page. Like for instance, for this index, we have this is what actually gets rendered when the application runs, and here is the code behind file, this index.cshtml.cs. That kind of like allows us to actually peek into this onGet method, for instance. And if we want to also expose a post, we might have here public void onPost and do some magic, do some actions here. So this means that there are actually or virtually only two places in a Razor Pages application where we might need to interact with the HTTP context. Now, the first one is actually maybe in this code behind files, in these methods like the onGet or onPost. Which might be a very well popular use case for that, because we might want to check for authentication, for claims, whatever. We might need to interact here with the HTTP context. Now, interacting or accessing the HTTP context in ASP.NET Core, as said, is very simple and straightforward. There are only a few things that we really have to be a little bit careful about, but other than that, everything should still work fine. Now, the first thing that we have to mention, and this actually is virtually the same for all different applications on ASP.NET Core, is that usually we don't really need to inject the HTTP context, because the HTTP context is mostly already provided by ASP.NET Core where we need it. Now, the only problem and confusions comes from the fact that the HTTP context usually is maybe exposed using different names, and we will look into that after we also will have a sneak peek into how we access the HTTP context in the CS HTML file. But going back here to this page model file, accessing the HTTP context is very easy. And let's assume that we have a variable message and we want to get something from the HTTP context and place that into this variable. Now that would actually be very easy, because this page model exposes a property which is of type HTTP context and which provides us the HTTP context for the current request. Now remember, here in ASP.NET Core, for all these type of platforms that we will look today, actually the working here is very simple. Everything is based on this pattern of request and response. Of course, you might have some background tasks, but that is a total different story. But generally, nothing happens really in ASP.NET Core unless you have a request. And now the only thing that happen, or the only things that happen, is only to actually generate a response for that request. And that's why we have this kind of warranty that each time we need to do something here in our application, there is also a request. And of course, we will also then have this HTTP context. So here it means that we can maybe, I don't know, take a look at the request, and maybe, I don't know, let's take the path base, for instance, and let's make it a string, and that's what we actually want to place in this variable. And that's actually it. That's how you use the HTTP context in this code behind file of a Razor Pages application. Now, of course, the next thing would be to think about how we actually access the HTTP context. Maybe we need it already in this CS HTML file, or also directly into this CS HTML file. Now, this is actually very simple, because we can here in this code behind, or in this code part, we could, for instance, save here var message, and we say equals, and exactly like we have it in the page model, because in behind actually there's the same partial class, we have here this HTTP context property that we can actually access, and we can do the same thing that we did earlier. So for request, and yeah, just give me 1 second here. I guess there is something that I just need to fix here, which was not fixed before, so bear just 1 second with me. I guess that should be done, and we can come back to our screen right now. So here we have this HTTP context request, and on this request we want, let's say, also take the path base, and we want to have it as a string. So we have this toString method on it, and of course semicolon at the end. And let's just refactor a little bit what we have here. Let's maybe delete all of this, and instead of displaying that type of message that we had earlier, we just want to display our message, and that would be it. Now let me place a breakpoint here, because I want to show you that we actually get to work or get to access the HTTP context, and we already have all the information from the context here, and we'll also have it here in this page model. So maybe let's also put a breakpoint here, and that should be actually good to go. Now we are here in this Razor Pages application, so let's debug only this one, because that's what we actually want to start right now. And it should fire up our very simple Razor Pages application that should actually, first of all, go through our breakpoints, of course, but then we can also see the path string that will be probably displayed on the home page of this application. Now it takes just a little bit until this actually fires up, but we can already see that we are right now in this onGet method, so we are already here. So we can just go through that, and we see that if we click on the HTTP context, we see that we have all the information about that request, like the default request here. We have the body, we have the content length, we have the form, but we don't have really a form right now, the host, for instance. So everything that you might expect to have in this HTTP context, you have it here. So really no problem with that. And of course, now after this passes, ASP.NET Core wants to render this view, and here we hit this other breakpoint, and in this case we have this path string, which is actually an empty string, of course, because there is nothing really what we have requested. We made only a request for the host in this case. But once again, if we take a look here at this HTTP context, we'll see that once again we have all the information that we need here. So I guess with that one we would be good to go. Of course, under welcome we don't really have anything, because once again we don't really have a path string here, because we made a request only for the host. And yeah, that would be it. So in summary, that's actually how you access the HTTP context in a Razor Pages application. There are two places where you might want to access it. One place would be in the code behind files, and that's very easy because we have this HTTP context property that is exposed. And then you might want to use it in the CS HTML itself, and then you can also use the same HTTP context property that is already exposed by ASP.NET Core, because everything here happens as a part of the request. Now, let's go to the other application type, and let's take just a little bit a look at an MVC application. Now, the MVC application is fairly different from a Razor Pages application. Of course, when it comes to the views, we still have these CS HTML files, like for instance here for the home and here we have the index, but we also have controllers in this case. So here actually we might be in a scenario where we might want to actually have this or access this HTTP context both in the controller, but also maybe in the view. And this time I will start with the view itself, because here is actually one of the places where there might be a little bit of confusion where you compare Razor pages to a regular ASP.NET Core MVC application, because you are still in the same type of concept, like having a CS/HTML file, which is essentially just a Razor view. And we have seen that in a Razor Pages application, we can simply access that by using or by accessing the HTTP context property that we already have on the page model. And that simply works. Now, let's assume we want to make the same thing here. So in the Razor view of a regular MVC application. Now, the thing is here that the HTTP context is still exposed as part of a property. The only thing is that the property right now here in MVC is called context, not HTTP context, but context. But other than that, it's exactly the same. You can actually get all the type of information that you might expect or actually want. Let's take pet base and let's make to string once again, just to see that actually everything works. So once again, we are actually in kind of like the same idea, like working in a Razor view. However, previously we did work in a Razor Pages application, and now we are working in an MVC application. And we see that we actually use different namings for the same thing. So that is maybe the place that might be a little bit confusing. So once again, just to summarize this, when it comes to working with Razor views, depending if you are in a Razor Pages application or if you are in a regular MVC application, in Razor Pages, you use the property HTTP context to access the HTTP context. And in MVC, you just use this property context, which exposes exactly the same HTTP context. So in behind, everything is actually working exactly the same. Now, if we go to the controller, and here there is a discussion that we might probably also split at a certain point between what we can do here in this controller that returns views and our API controllers, because we also want to take a look at an API project. But here actually it's exactly the same. So you don't really have to inject the HTTP context in your controller. If the controller is the only place where you need the HTTP context, you can just simply access it. And you can say message equals HTTP context. And then we have here request. And yeah, let's take once again the pet base and let's make it to string. Okay, so it's exactly the same that we did also in the Razor view. And you see that here in this case, the name here is HTTP context. So in the view, we just use the context as name. And in the controller, the name that exposes us the HTTP context is HTTP context. So that's actually another place where you might get a little bit confused, because in a controller you access it using a certain name, but in the view you access it using another name. But in the end, actually they expose exactly the same thing, exactly the same instance of the HTTP context. So all the information should be actually exactly the same. No real difference between them. Cool. So we have covered these main aspects of how we actually access the HTTP context in a Razor Pages application and in an MVC application. And we have seen that it's very easy because ASP.NET Core provides us with this information already built in. So we don't need to do anything to get it. We just need to know how we can access it using which type of name. And here we have seen this part of like confusion where we might use different namings to access the exact same thing in the end. So that's why also, or that's probably one of the reasons that I think it's that it was actually important to create a video like this that kind of like summarizes all these aspects of using the HTTP context. Now let's take look further and let's go to our API project, because in our API project, of course, if we think about the controller, like we have here controllers and we have this weather forecast controller, and we have reworked this, what this controller does just a little bit, we have actually moved everything that was regarding or concerning actually generating weather forecasts. We can even remove that, I forgot that. We have moved that in a service. So in the controller, we just have the idea of we call a service and we get the forecast from the service and we return them, and that's basically it. And of course, for that, we have this weather forecast service that we have also wired up with the DI container so that everything is set up and can be injected properly. Now, of course, this is a controller, no matter if it's an API. ASP.NET Core also provides us with the same way of accessing the HTTP context like we saw in a regular MVC application. So it would be var message here equals HTTP context, and then we can have the request, for instance, and then the pet base or pet, whatever, doesn't really matter here. And here we would like to have this toString on that. So that would be it. So in the controller, that's it. It's exactly the same like in the controllers for a regular MVC application, because in the end, this HTTP context is part of the controller base. So no matter if you inherit the controller base like you do in an API usually, or if you inherit the entire controller class that also has support for views, you also have the same concept of the HTTP context, and it is exposed the same way because it's actually exactly the same. Because also the controller inherits from controller base. So this is how we access the HTTP context in the controller of a web API. However, in web APIs, and actually that might also happen for regular MVC applications, but I have seen mostly in web APIs this need for custom middleware. So how do we access the HTTP context in a custom middleware? Now, for that, we have created also a my middleware class, which exposes a custom middleware. And actually, I have already implemented this idea because it was just part of me implementing this my middleware, because it didn't really make sense to just waste a lot of time writing all this code here during this video. But the idea is, and the main focus here is that when you create a middleware, you have this kind of task invoke async method, or if you want to make it synchronous, the invoke method. Actually, what happens there is that you need to provide the HTTP context. So you can inject it directly here into this invoke async. However, here there is one thing that really we need to be careful. Don't inject the HTTP context in the middleware constructor. And that's very important. And if we understand how middleware work, we actually also understand why. Because the idea is that when the application starts up, we are here in this program. Now, what ASP.NET Core does, of course, during the startup process, it goes actually to all this type of middleware and registers that middleware. Now, registering the middleware, it's actually just creating an instance of them. What this means, of course, creating a constructor or invoking the constructor. Now, when this happens, that's the startup process of the ASP.NET Core app. So there is no request, and therefore we don't have an HTTP context. So if you try to inject the HTTP context in the constructor, you will get an error right when you run the application. So never try to inject the HTTP context, or by that matter, never inject any scope service in the constructor of the middleware, because this constructor gets always called during the startup process, and not when, and at that point, of course, we don't have an HTTP request. But instead, the method that will be invoked whenever a new request comes in, so we have a request and we have a scope, is this invoke async method. And that gets invoked per request, and therefore we can simply inject the HTTP context into it. ASP.NET Core already provides us with this context, so we can simply reuse that. So that's here the really nice thing about using this HTTP context in a middleware. Always in the invoke or invoke async methods, never, of course, in the constructor. Like, you never should inject scope services in the constructor because they will fail. And I guess that for a middleware, that pretty much covers it up. But there is one last very, very important topic that I would like to actually tackle, because this is a scenario that I'm sure you will get a lot. Now we have this weather forecast service, let's say, and this weather forecast service gets injected into this controller. Now, it is very common that when you are inside the service, you also need actually to access the HTTP context, because you might need to retrieve information about the currently logged in user, and you might want to retrieve actually a lot of other information that you can find in the HTTP context. So how do you do that? Because one way would be actually, I don't know, maybe we have this constructor of the service, we just say we want an HTTP context into that, and then maybe, I don't know, come here in the controller and instantiate ourselves a new instance of the weather forecast service and inject the context. But that's not what we want to do. We want to use DI, because we work with ASP.NET Core, and one of the most important things in ASP.NET Core is the DI container that helps us a lot. So we want totally to use that. Now, the idea is that we need a way to inject the HTTP context in this weather forecast service. So one thing that you would do probably would say private read only here, HTTP context, and let's call this just HTTP, okay? And you will say no problem, surely there must be an HTTP context in the DI container. So yeah, let's just inject it here, and let's name this HTTP, and let's assign that here HTTP equals HTTP. I'm not sure exactly what is wrong here. Should be like that. Okay, what is the problem? So this is a controller, this is a controller. Let me just check here. I'm not sure what really is wrong here. All constructor body, add constructor body. Okay, but okay, there's a semicolon there. Okay, there was a semicolon there. Cool. So you would say right now, okay, we use the DI and ASP.NET Core, we pray that it will provide us with an HTTP context. However, the problem is it won't, because HTTP context is not registered or is not injectable by default as the HTTP context itself. And this is where actually things might go a little bit wrong, and where we need to know exactly how that should be done the proper way. It's not complicated, and of course everything actually boils down to this program class where we add our services. So if we want to inject the HTTP context in services or in any other type of component that we might register in the DI container, then the first thing to do is we'll need to go to the application, and let's say here builder services, and ASP.NET Core has this default extension method, add HTTP context accessor, and that's actually the method that, or the service that we need to instantiate. And here once again, it's very important to pay attention to invoke this method actually before you invoke this one. Although it's not really clear for me 100% if this affects the one way or the other, but just to have things a little bit more clearer, as we need the HTTP context accessor in the weather forecast service, we register the HTTP context accessor before any other services where we might need an HTTP context. Now, when we register this to the DI container, this would provide us with a service of type HTTP context accessor. So it's not directly the HTTP context, you would say, but actually it's very easy to work with that. So let's say instead of getting here an HTTP context, what we want to get here is an HTTP context accessor. So that's what we want to get, because this is what actually that method, that extension method that we have called actually adds to the DI container. It's an HTTP context accessor. So now that you have an accessor, how can we get an HTTP context from the accessor? Well, that's actually very, very easy, because on the accessor we have only one property, and that is the HTTP context. So in the constructor, we just use that context and assign it to our field. And of course, here we can then use this context var message equals, and we can say here, for instance, what we did in all the part, request, and then at base, and then these two string method, and we should be good to go. And this is how you properly use the HTTP context or access the HTTP context within custom components in your DI in ASP.NET Core. Most probably you will need that in services, or if you work more with the CQRS approach, probably in your handlers. So in that case, in your handlers, you would inject the HTTP context accessor, and from that, you would get then the HTTP context that you want to work with. And yeah, I guess that should be it. As said, it's not really complicated, but I really hope that this video kind of did shed a little bit of light about the confusions that might arise when it comes to accessing the HTTP context in different ASP.NET Core applications. And there is only one scenario that we haven't covered yet, of course, and that is the scenario of a Blazor server application. But as promised, probably the next video here on this channel will be exactly on how to achieve that, because that is a really separate discussion that really needs a topic to itself. So we will definitely do that, and hope that would kind of like sum up this concept of working with the HTTP context or accessing the HTTP context in different types of ASP.NET Core applications. If you enjoyed this video and you think that content might be useful for others, don't be shy and feel free to share it, spread the word. Sharing is caring, they say, and I would really appreciate it very, very much. And of course, subscribe to this channel and also hit the notification bell button to be notified whenever something new happens on the Code Wrinkles channel, because you might really like it. This being said, thank you very, very much for watching and tuning in, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.